Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our discussion of the New World. Many of the notes and images that you will see here are courtesy of a fantastic textbook called Give Me Liberty by the author Eric Foner, historian, and published by W. Norton and Company. The New World. So what we talk about with this presentation is the European entrance into the Americas and the clash that's going to occur as European cultures come into conflict with Native American cultures. And of course, with the spread of disease, many natives, 90% of which wiped out in North and South America over the course of about 50 years. But let's get into it. So for advanced placement, these are the topics from the advanced placement curriculum that you see here. So AP would like you to know this. Now, of course, this is not the largest. As a matter of fact, this is the smallest segment of information that you need from AP in terms of proportion of the exam. But nonetheless, these are the topics upon which the College Board Advanced Placement would like for you to focus. And from the College Board Advanced Placement, these are their main objective questions. And some key terms, not necessarily from College Board. A lot of them are maybe, I don't know, just ones that I've thrown together from doing this a lot. Okay, so once the Europeans come into contact with the natives, obviously the Europeans are going to draw images of what they see. Here, for example, an English artist, John White, this is what he witnessed on the banks of North Carolina, and he was part of an expedition led by Sir Walter Raleigh. You may have remembered this expedition unsuccessfully founding the so-called today lost colony of Roanoke. Nonetheless, you can see European depictions of natives here and what the Europeans point out, and we'll see quite a bit of these throughout this presentation. So here we have a map of the world from the early 16th century, and this engraving basically is the European knowledge of the New World. Now remember, the Europeans had no knowledge of the New World until after Columbus, and even Columbus didn't have any knowledge of it because Columbus is going to go to his deathbed believing that he found another route to Asia. Nonetheless, here is how the Europeans would have viewed the planet at this time, or at least North and South America, their understanding of it by the time we are into almost the middle 16th century. So to give us a little bit of background here, focusing in on North America, here is what some of the major tribes that we see, and you see Cahokia there in the center of North America, or almost in the center of North America, one of the major cities, areas of exchange in North America. Looking to the south into modern-day Mexico, you see the Aztecs, the major civilization that existed prior to the Aztecs, the Mayans. And then way further south, all the way down into Peru and Chile, you see the Inca. Some of the most advanced civilizations, the Aztecs and the Inca, just as advanced as the Europeans once the Europeans come to town. The AP also stresses that you know what the Great Basin is, so there's your definition. So what we see here is an example of the diversity of North American natives. Typically, we tend to think of North America as just being, quote, Indians, and the Europeans come in and they deal with all the same, quote, Indians. Simply not the case. North America was extremely diverse. If we were just to look at California, which you see here, you can see the sheer number of different ethnic, cultural, tribal groups just in what is today California. So to think that North America lacked diversity, quite the contrary. The Europeans run into a very diverse atmosphere. Okay, but there are some major divides here. So American versus European technology by the time we get to 1492. So in the Western Hemisphere, there really wasn't any livestock. There were no cows, there were no pigs, there were no horses by the time the Europeans arrived. The horse had gone extinct, I don't know, 10,000 years before or something. Nonetheless, since they didn't have livestock, well, that didn't really necessitate the need to make things like a plow or things like a wagon. So thus, there's no real use of a wheel or axled wheeled vehicles, right, as you would have seen with the Europeans. Vehicles as in like carts, things like this. So when the Europeans come across this, they immediately view these natives as backward, as not very technologically advanced. As a matter of fact, agriculture is not even invented until around 7000 BCE in Mexico and Peru, a good 1,000 years after Mesopotamia and Eurasia are able to have their agricultural revolution. The Europeans, when they come in, they have metal tools, they have machines, gunpowder, guns, and some scientific knowledge, compass, things like this, in their ships, the caravel, much more technology than the natives would have had. And no society north of Mexico had a written language. So because these natives lacked things like wheeled vehicles and some of the technologies that the Europeans had, the Europeans used this as a rationalization to conquer and take over the Americas. But the Americas are much more advanced than you might think. For example, here's Cahokia. Cahokia is outside of what is today present-day St. Louis, and Cahokia began to emerge right around 600 CE, Common Era. Here's what Cahokia would have looked like around the year 1200. Cahokia had tens of thousands of inhabitants and was a major trade network really along the Mississippi River with goods coming from all across North America. So you had trade, you had diversity, you had technology, just not the same types of diversity and trade and technology as the Europeans had. And Cahokia, we don't know what they would have called the city. The name actually comes from some French explorers who passed through in the 1600s, and there was a local tribe called Cahokia. So that's what the name has become. But here you can watch a brief video. Please check out this video clip. It's about 10 minutes on Cahokia. The Cahokia were, or rather Cahokia, the city, the natives who lived around Cahokia were mound builders. We have a lot of mound builders as you go from the Mississippi River, going back east to places like Ohio and all the way down south to places as far south as Georgia, the Etowah Mounds in Georgia. Nonetheless, please do check out this quick 10-minute clip here that discusses Cahokia. Okay, the Aztecs. So the Aztecs were no joke. The Aztecs were one of the most well-developed, technologically advanced civilizations on the planet. Tenochtitlan, their capital, which is close to modern-day Mexico City, had canals and bridges and dams, had a huge temple at the center. They had philosophers, they had education system, they had a governing system under an emperor. The Aztecs were extremely advanced. When the Spanish came in contact with Tenochtitlan, the capital, they were just blown away. They're like, oh my gosh, we don't have anything like this back in Europe, right? The problem is that the Aztecs also were heavily involved in ritual sacrifices. They were a very bloody and gory civilization that sacrificed tens of thousands of people per year. And not only that, they had a lot of enemies, because typically when the Aztecs went to war, they played the game of capture the enemy, because you want to be able to use that enemy to sacrifice to the gods. And this disgusted the Europeans. The Europeans viewed the Aztecs as godless, as infidels. Now, of course, it's kind of ironic that this disgusted the Europeans, because had you gone to Europe in the 15, 16, 1700s, you would have seen public executions of so-called witches being burned at the stake, for example. And here you see a European depiction from a Spanish conquistador depicting Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. And like I said, it's no joke. So what about Native American society? We already pointed out it was extremely diverse. They had their own political system. They had their own religious beliefs, hundreds of languages. They didn't really identify as a single unified people. This whole idea of a nation, that's a European concept. That's a Western concept. That concept didn't really exist. You identified in North America on your social group, your immediate social group, or your kinship, the tribe, the village, chiefdom, and then the confederacy. Confederacy is where you would have some tribes that would, join together in this loosely formed and held together system for, mutual defense, things like this in conflict and in war. But the reality is that, with the natives, the ability to follow one's spiritual values, support and secure the well-being of their community, that's what they live for. Those were their key values. Native Americans in North America, for the most part, were monotheistic, but they gave spiritual value to inanimate objects, trees, rocks, whatever, bodies of water. So to the Europeans, this was also heretical. Families were often matrilineal. In other words, the family line went through the mother, as opposed to the West, where it goes through the father. Wealth and material goods just weren't that important to the natives. Once again, that's also a Western concept. The whole idea of owning land and making profit and money off of the land, that would have been a foreign concept to natives in North America. As opposed to the Europeans, who believed that land was the equivalent of freedom, of liberty, to own one's own land. And the natives gave precedent to these kind of shamans, these medicine men, these religious leaders who could, communicate with the gods, this type of thing. Once again, to the Europeans, though, that was absolutely blasphemous. So the Europeans basically were able to characterize the natives as savages, mostly because they were not Christian. And here we see another drawing from a European, John White again, and this time showing this ceremony of Native Americans. And in this case, you can see, well, maybe you can't see it, but I guess it kind of captures the idea that natives believed that there were sacred spirits that could be found in both living and inanimate things. Here's a funny one. So this is from a 1600s engraving from a French Jesuit of a Iroquois longhouse. And here is how he saw it. And apparently on the day that he was drawing this, he noticed the devil up there lurking in front of one of these longhouses. I'm sure he got out of their stat. Nonetheless, yeah, right. So, I mean, basically what this is saying is that the Europeans viewed Native Americans as worshipers of the devil because they lacked Christianity that the Europeans had. So natives in the land. So we hinted at this earlier. Natives believed in the right to use land, but they didn't really own the land. That was a foreign concept. You had a lot of Native American groups where the chief would focus on giving away things, and people who hoarded lots of things were considered below, like the lower class of people within tribes or groups. Basically, tribes would have, specific hunting regions, right? But for the most part, the land was pretty wide open. Now, that's not to say that, had you trespassed on, well, there's no trespassing, I guess, had you wandered onto a chunk of land that was being used by, another tribe, sure, you might get an arrow through your head or whatever, right? Because they could very well kill you. But the whole idea of fencing off land and controlling land and growing things off of it to try to make a profit, that's a Western European idea. That's not a Native American idea. Land was more of a common resource. It's not a commodity. Now for the Europeans, like we said, to own land, that's the hallmark of liberty. That's what independence is all about, to own your own tract of land. And here you can see some of the different beliefs, languages, some of the, I guess, things that these natives did, their occupations, and how they got by on a regular basis. So once again, this also kind of alludes to the diversity of North America. And here, this really gets into this whole idea of not owning the land, right? If you look at this map here, it's a Catawba map, a native group in what is today Virginia, near what is today Jamestown, or I guess it was then too. And what you notice here is that the map depicts not possession of territory, but rather trade and diplomatic connections between various native groups, right? So they thought in laying out land in terms of, oh, here's where this group tends to be, right? Here are the kind of trade relations that we have with them. Here's a trade route to get to them, and so on, right? It's not marked as in like, oh, here's this border, do not cross or it means war. Once again, that's a European Western concept. Gender relations is another thing that upset Europeans, poor Europeans. Most native societies, we pointed out earlier, were indeed matrilineal, but women actually held a good amount of power, especially in North American groups, where they could actually own their own tools. They could own their own dwellings. Now, women didn't really hold leadership positions, but you had a lot of older, the more elderly women who could participate in selecting village leaders and play a role in religious ceremonies, things like this. The men, the way that they showed, their masculinity was through hunting and war, right? They actually had the Iroquois up in northern North America. This game today that we call lacrosse, but lacrosse actually began as a war game, a not so friendly war game, but nonetheless a war game in North America. Women, though, were responsible for farming and, of course, household duties. Now, this is also going to irk Europeans because women, we'll see this in another slide, would actually go out in the fields and farm. To the Europeans, that is what men were supposed to do. So, all of these things are kind of problematic from the European perspective, right? Women aren't supposed to have these broad roles and these powers and these rights, essentially, in the European mind. As a matter of fact, in Europe, women were considered property of men. As ridiculous as that sounds, it's the case. In Europe, they practiced this, what we call coverture, where essentially a woman would surrender her legal identity once she married to a man. Any monies or dowry, whatever she had coming into the marriage, is now suddenly the man's. The children belong to the man. So if things go awry in the relationship and the couple separate, it was just a given that the children would go to the man, for example, even if that man was abusive, neglectful, or whatever. It didn't matter. That is just how European society rolled. And here is what also upset Europeans. What doesn't these days, or those days, I guess. You can see women out here farming in the fields. That is a foreign concept to the Europeans. Women were supposed to be in the home. Now you do see some men here helping with the planting and so on. But for women to even be out working in this capacity at all to the Europeans was just bizarre to them. As a matter of fact, a European woman was supposed to look like this. European women were supposed to be as white as possible because the darker your skin, that was indicative of having to labor. God forbid that you actually have to work for a living. But that's how the Europeans operated, right? If you had darker skin, it's because the sun beat down on your skin and made your skin darker because you had to work out in the fields all day. So women, and men for that matter, but especially women, went out of their way to try to make sure that their skin was as white as possible. Oh, and here you see some information from the Ladies' Dictionary of 1694. You can read about some pretty weird things that women were supposed to do to help their look back in the day. Okay, the expansion of Europe. So this is going to change the trajectory of world history. When the Europeans run into the Americas, everything changes. This is a moment of really serendipity for the Europeans to run into the Americas. They're going to gain control of the Americas, and it's going to put Europe, specifically countries like Britain and France and Spain, it's going to put them ahead of countries or areas that would have been dominant prior to this, like, for example, China. So now the Europeans, now, of course, they don't know this when they run into the Americas. They're not like, yes, we found the Americas. Now we're going to win the race to global dominance, right? They didn't think in those terms. But looking back, this was the game changer. And Adam Smith would have agreed. Adam Smith, of course, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, the book that established the concept of capitalism. He didn't use the term capitalism or even create it, but it's what he was talking about, free markets. And he pointed out that, look, the discovery of the Americas and the sea route around Africa to get to Asia, these are the two most important events in the history of humankind, of mankind, because this is what created this global economy. And then on top of that, it's what's going to help the Europeans, for better or worse, come to eventually dominate the planet. So in the 1400s, the Europeans didn't really know a whole heck of a lot about the world. A lot of their information about places like China or Eastern Asia came from the 1300s works of people like Marco Polo, right? But by the time we get into the middle of the 15th century, one country in particular, Portugal, is trying its best to begin to explore not only the western coast of Africa, where they're going to take over some islands and try to grow the biggest commodity, sugarcane, but the biggest ambition, the biggest goal is to find a route around Africa to get access to the Indian Ocean and Asia for trade. Now, of course, what prevents this after 1453 is the fall of Constantinople. When Constantinople falls, which is where you see the arrow going to the gold arrow, center of your, well, it's not the center, going across Asia there. When Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks, who were Sunni Muslim, well, they now control that trade network, Silk Road, basically going into Asia, which basically cut off European access. The Europeans were Christian. On top of that, you had a lot of merchants from places like Venice in Italy, who were also very powerful and could manipulate trade in the Mediterranean. So basically what European countries say is, all right, we need to find an alternate route. And as you can see, the Portuguese do. Bartolomeo Diaz, and then reaches the Cape of Good Hope, and then by the late 1490s, Vasco da Gama is going to get all the way around southern Africa and find that passageway over into the Indian Ocean. So what is motivating these Europeans? Well, we alluded to this to an extent, right? In Native America, for example, it was this belief amongst the Europeans that the natives simply were a bunch of heretics, that they were infidels, that they were uncivilized, that they needed to be Christianized, basically. Native religion, land use, the gender relations, all these things were, quote, barbaric to the Europeans. They viewed the natives as idolizing false gods, right? As believing in things like physical inanimate objects having spiritual values and things like this, which is, blasphemous to the Europeans. Not only that, but when the Europeans looked at the land and how the natives weren't really using it for profit, the Europeans were kind of like, in this case, we're talking the Spanish, right? The Portuguese, and then later on the English. They basically say, what are you doing? got all this land here. We need to make profit off of this. That's progress, right? You got to claim your stake of land. You got to sell that on the on the market to make money. Well, the natives didn't believe in this, which basically drives the Europeans to say, all right, we need to make use of this land. Here's what we're going to do. So how did the Europeans get there? Well, the Europeans had a plethora of technologies by the time we get into the 1400s. The caravel ship, one of the most important, which the Portuguese began to use in the early 1400s, helped the Europeans traverse all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. The lateen sail, the kind of triangular sail you see there, helping them to kind of cut against the wind and be able to traverse across broad distances across the water. The Europeans had the compass thanks to the Silk Road and trade over the course of centuries coming out of China. The sextant, that one's a little bit later. That's actually going to come out of England. The astrolabe they would use stars very much like the sextant to navigate. And of course, the other big technology the Europeans had, thanks in large part to the Mongols and the Chinese, was the gun. And this guns and disease are going to make all the difference, right? Because the Europeans have number one, disease, and number two, disease, and number three, the gun, this is going to allow them to be able to take out the Americas. The other thing that is going to unfortunately assist the Europeans in conquering the Americas is going to be the use of slaves. In this case, slaves from Africa, but of course they also are going to enslave the natives as well. So let's take a moment and talk about this kind of history of slavery real quick. And I shouldn't say real quick because this topic deserves much more justice than that. But for our purposes moving forward, just so we can gain an understanding of how slavery operated and also how race operated as we rolled into the 1500s and 1600s. So slavery has existed for longer than we can record, right? Since the bigger person went to the smaller person and overpowered them and used them, right? Slavery in Africa predated the European arrival. Islam used enslavement as well, right? That's not to say that the Europeans didn't also have enslavement, right? But nonetheless, Africans who owned slaves in Africa, these people tended to be criminals or debtors or war captives, right? So they weren't really a slave per se as we might think of the term slavery today, right? Typically, people didn't have money, right, monetary wealth to pay off a debt or to pay the court to, lessen their charge or whatever. So what do? You offer your labor instead. So basically that was the type of slavery that we saw in Africa prior to the European arrival. And it was just one of many forms of labor, right? But the other big thing too is that slavery in Africa prior to the Europeans, slaves, quote unquote, had well-defined rights. You could own property, you could get married, you can marry free persons, but the biggest thing for those who were enslaved in Africa is that they could eventually become free. And that is probably the biggest difference between European enslavement and African enslavement, because that's not going to be an option amongst the European slave traders and owners. European slavery changes the equation. European slavery is going to be, sadly, a life sentence. For many of the slaves who are pulled from Western Africa and taken to the Caribbean due to farm sugarcane, due to the conditions, their lifespan, perfectly healthy 23-year-old male, for example, lifespan was about 2 or 3 years because of the brutality of the environment and of the labor itself. And basically, just in that last half of the 15th century, you've got 100,000 African slaves transported just places like Spain and Portugal. And by the time we get into the early 1500s, they're being transported to the Caribbean. Now, many of the slaves were procured by slave traders who were African. You had entire kingdoms like the Asante, for example, or the Oyo, who had these warlords who profited from the Europeans wanting slaves. Now, the Europeans really couldn't penetrate into Africa. You had some instances like the Portuguese, for example, but Europeans wouldn't last long in Africa. They called Africa the white man's coffin because Europeans had not adapted to some of the diseases that were present there. So basically, they would fund these African warlords with liquor, with guns, weaponry, gold, whatever, to go in and capture African people, bring them to the coast, and sell them to the Europeans. Nonetheless, the enslavement of Africans in the Americas is one of the saddest moments in human history, and is going to lead to the deaths of millions of people. And that's not to diminish, too, that when the Europeans first come into the Americas, the Spanish, the Portuguese, they enslaved the natives. The Spanish believed by enslaving the natives that they were actually helping them. They were helping to Christianize them. They were helping to civilize them. The problem is many of your natives that were there are going to die of disease. On top of that, it's important to talk about the concept of race. So the concept of race as we know it today, which is this artificial construct that we humans have created in our brain, the whole idea of race, because the reality is that we're all made of the same stuff, okay? But the thing is that our brains have created this artificial social construct where we divide people by the color of skin. However, that didn't exist in the 1500s. Race, relatively speaking, to the course of humanity is a relatively new concept. The whole idea of race and concept of dividing people by the color of their skin doesn't really come about until the early 1600s. Prior to that, the big dividing issue was one of religion, one of faith. You were either Christian or an infidel. You were either Islamic or an infidel. Right, so that is how people divided each other, or at least that's certainly how the Europeans divided other people coming out of places like Africa or out of the Islamic world. And then we get that guy, Chris Columbus. So Christopher Columbus, who was from Italy, somewhere, Genoa, something like that. Basically, this guy's got some funny ideas, right? He is convinced. He has done some thorough reading of Marco Polo's works, and he's convinced that the Earth is not really all that big, and that if the Europeans would stop trying to go south down around Africa and just go west across the Atlantic, boom, they're going to run right into Asia. Was he correct? Technically, yes, because the Earth is a globe, right? But Columbus made a couple of mistakes, well, more than a couple. Number one, he kind of thought that the Earth was shaped a little bit like a pear, but let's not get into that one. But he also thought that the globe was about 20% smaller than it actually is. Nonetheless, Columbus was a hard-headed man. Columbus, in October of 1492, ends up in what is today the Bahamas. And he is convinced when he comes ashore that he has found probably somewhere in the Indies. Now, the Indies... Another funny thing about the Europeans, when the Europeans looked at what today we call Asia, specifically places like China, Japan, India, Vietnam, whatever, Philippines, these places were called the Indies. So if you were in Japan, you were in the Indies. If you were in China, you were in the Indies. In other words, the Europeans viewed these people as it's just all kind of the same people, right? And that this whole area is just one common place. Thus, when Columbus lands in what is today the Bahamas, he had no clue. His assumption was somewhere in Japan, right? Or what he just would have called the Indies. So hence the people he comes across are Indians. Now, Columbus, upon this discovery, he was funded by the Spanish government, Ferdinand and Isabella. Upon this discovery, he brings back some natives who are going to die, well, not all of them, when he gets back to Europe, and announced this successful finding of this, quote, route to Asia, right? Columbus is going to come back a few more times. He's going to be a governor of a territory briefly down in the Caribbean. And to his dying day, Columbus dies in, 1504, 05, something like that. To his dying day, he believed that he found a route to Asia. As a matter of fact, it was proven by Amerigo Vespucci by the end of the 1490s, the late 1490s, that indeed Columbus had actually found a whole new continent, a whole new land, new from the European perspective. However, Columbus simply refused to believe this and continued to believe that he found a new route to Asia. And obviously, you know, Columbus, profit played a big role, religion played a big role as well, right? This idea of spreading Catholicism. Remember, the Protestant Reformation hasn't happened yet. Nonetheless, with Columbus's discovery, accidental, serendipitous, whatever you want to call it, it's going to change everything. And basically, over the course of time, the Europeans will bring sugarcane to the Caribbean. Sugarcane becomes the #1 commodity. The main commodities were sugar, sugar, and sugar. And Hispaniola, which is modern day Haiti and Dominican Republic, this place becomes the center of global trade because it becomes one of the wealthiest I guess, colonies around on the globe, because first it starts with sugar, and then sugar, and then sugar, but then later on tobacco becomes a huge commodity, and the vast majority of slaves from Africa are going to come to the Caribbean. They're going to be brought to the Caribbean, I should say, to work in these sugarcane fields. But there's good old Amerigo Vespucci. He's the one who's going to point out that, nope, sorry, Chris, you actually discovered some new land. You would think Columbus would have wanted to be like, oh, wow, okay, yes, I'm going to take that one because that one just sounds even cooler. I discovered 2 new places. But no. Anyway, America named after Amerigo, America being the feminized version of Amerigo. I still think they should have gone with Vespucci. Now, of course, after Columbus, word is spread, right? The printing press had been around now for about 40 years, give or take. And once Columbus lands in this place, other European explorers are going to follow. And obviously, you know, with these European explorers following, eventually it's going to come to light that, you know, these are totally new places, new to the Europeans. And there is good old Johannes Gutenberg. Gutenberg's printing press, you know, is going to allow for the spread of the word of this discovery by Columbus. So the Portuguese and the Spanish are going to be the first to really set up their empires in the Americas, and the Spanish are going to become one of the most powerful of these. Not to diminish the Portuguese. The Portuguese become much more focused on the Indian Ocean. But the Spanish especially set up their empire in the Americas. And of course, the Spanish believe that they have a superior culture to the natives. They received a decree from a pope to spread Catholicism, which then gave the Spaniards this kind of missionary zeal, right? And, you know, they felt that these natives needed to be civilized. Now, eventually, remember the first Spaniards really to come into the New World were the conquerors or conquistadors, people like Pizarro and Cortez. Eventually the Spanish government, being Catholic and all, kind of says, so we're enslaving all of these human beings and a lot of people are dying. Maybe this is bad. So eventually by the 1540s, the Spanish government will pass what are called the New Laws, forbidding the enslavement of natives, for example. But that doesn't mean that the Spanish become nice guys all of a sudden. Nonetheless, the first major permanent European settlements will be set up down in the southwest of the United States, Santa Fe, and the overall first permanent settlement in St. Augustine, Florida, set up by the Spanish. So the Spanish Empire, number one, you know, to begin with, it was driven by this quest for wealth. They want gold, they want silver, they want spices. Second, we get this kind of idea of national glory for the Spanish Empire, and then, of course, to spread Catholicism. These conquistadors who come in are absolutely vicious. They're cunning, they're arrogant, they're tough, they're well armed, especially armed with disease. And, Cortez is going to be able to take out the Aztecs by the, 1520. This guy Ferdinand Magellan is going to be able to circumnavigate the globe. Pizarro about that time is going to take out the Inca all the way down in Peru. So eventually, what happens is as this kind of evolves, we get things like the new laws, which kind of forbids this whole idea of this kind of plundering and conquering and enslavement. So you start seeing the lawyers and the bureaucrats begin to move in and kind of govern these New World territories for the Spanish. And even though they had gotten rid of things like enslavement of natives, they set up this encomienda labor system, as it's called. And basically what this did is the King of Spain would say to some landowner or some peninsulare, as they would have called them, who has come over to the New World, he would say basically, look, this piece of paper here entitles you to the labor, in other words, the humans who exist in this tract of land. You control their labor, right? So that leads to really enslavement to an extent, right? But nonetheless, this basically allows some Spanish landowner to have free labor, which means he's going to be able to grow crops or whatever and sell those on a global market. The big catch with the encomienda system, though, is that it was not, it could not be passed down, right? So your son couldn't inherit it, right? I guess he would have to reapply or something. Hopefully it was more efficient than the DMV, but I don't know. And what you see here, the Great Spanish-American Empire, and you can see the Portuguese and the Spanish, but especially the Spanish, really just conquering the Americas. And you can see all the places where they're pulling out the gold. And I just really like that picture. It's kind of cool. So let's try that again. Something called the Columbian Exchange. Here we go. You only hit the button a couple times. And you can see here, all of these goods that are going to find their ways to these places. Now, all those things up there at the top and all those things at the bottom that are listed, the things at the top had never been in Europe or Eurasia. They didn't exist there before 1492, which is simply amazing, right? In other words, these things were completely indigenous to the Americas. No one in China, no one in Europe, no one in Africa, Australia. None of these places had ever experienced any of these things, like chocolate, coca, right? Or the peanut, or tobacco, sweet potatoes. None of these things existed. Turkeys. How do you have Thanksgiving? And then if you look down there at the bottom, none of those things existed in the Americas. So if you could get in your time machine, and someday I will, but if you could get into your time machine and go back to the Americas to say 1491, none of those things on the bottom would be there. There were no pigs here. There were no horses here. There was no cattle. On the positive side, maybe that's positive too, I don't know. There was no flu. There was no typhus. There were no measles. There's no malaria. None of those things existed here. Okay. Syphilis was here, and the Europeans are going to bring that back to Europe too. But nonetheless, these other things did not exist. So think about the ecological impact of this. And this is what the Columbian Exchange is really about. This huge exchange of flora and fauna, plants and animals, radically altering the environment. Basically, when the Europeans come to the Americas and they bring their horses and their pigs and their cattle, what are they doing? And bring their sheep? They're trying to recreate Europe, right? They're altering the environment. And when they bring these things back to Eurasia, they're going to alter that environment as well. So the Earth undergoes a major environmental change because of Columbus. Thanks, Chris. But nonetheless, you can see what occurs with this. Now, don't confuse this with the Atlantic system. The Atlantic system is more referencing to economics. It includes things like the slave trade, but the exchange of goods for money. Whereas the Columbian Exchange just refers to this little bit more organic kind of process of exchanging plants, animals, disease, these kind of more natural things between land masses that had been separated for quite some time. And you can check out this clip here on the Columbian Exchange. I bet I did a better job, but just in case, watch that 6-minute clip on the Columbian Exchange. Well, this is very telling. We can see, how many millions of people were on the planet at this time. The world population around 1500 was probably about 500 million people, right? Which is a far cry from today's population, approaching 7 billion, right? But look at just how many people on the left side there were in the Americas, some 54 million, 55 million. But that's the thing. Of those 55 million people, within 30 to 50 years of Columbus's arrival, roughly 90% of those people will be wiped out by European war and disease, sadly. And this just gives you a better definition, or I guess a typed out definition of the Columbian Exchange here. But that's the key. It's disease, enslavement, military technology. That's what puts the Spanish over top and eventually the Europeans on top, and that's what's going to allow them to begin to conquer the planet as we roll into the 17 and 1800s. Now, the effects of disease, you had some Spanish officials and church officials, government and church officials, who would record, what was going on in the Americas. And one of the worst things that was going on was the smallpox epidemic that's going to wipe out the natives. Now, the Europeans, of course, had built up over the long course of time, not necessarily immunities, but a level of immunity to smallpox where, you might get it, you might have, some pretty terrible days, but it's not as likely to kill you. When it comes to the Americas, it's never ever been there. So it just wipes these people out. And a lot of this is recorded in the Codex. And you can read some interesting little FYI factoids there if you like. And just to give you an idea of the whole idea of spreading the faith, this kind of proselytizing effort of the Europeans, here's what, Cortez carried this image of the Virgin Mary, right? So this whole idea in conquering the Aztecs. So this whole idea of, it wasn't just about getting wealth and territory. It was also about this idea of spreading Catholicism, at least how the Europeans imagined it. So overall, basically, European expansion, native populations are basically wiped out, sadly, in North and South America. All the gold and silver that's going to be mined, mostly in South America, is going to find its way around the globe. And it's going to lead to rampant inflation. China is going to see its population explode because of all these new crops coming in, right? And also we're going to have this huge influx of silver and gold around the planet, especially silver. Silver becomes so abundant in China that it becomes their currency as we roll into the 1600s, right? So all these new products coming around, they're going to create all kinds of new wealth. People are going to gain lots of money who otherwise may not have, right? But the thing is, economically, the European countries still operate under a concept we call mercantilism. And mercantilism said that these colonies exist to feed the mother country, and that all things that come out of these colonies are supposed to go back to the king and or queen, right? That's going to be turned on its head as we keep rolling along by people who are earning their own wealth and asking a fundamental question: why do I need to give all of this wealth to a king or queen? We're going to see all these rivalries also develop between these European powers. These rivalries are going to become even more pronounced after 1517 with the Protestant Reformation, where now you have this competition between Protestants and Catholics to spread Christianity. The Spanish are going to create their own empire, unique empire in the Americas. They're going to set up the casta system, this kind of hierarchy based on race, where basically you have the Peninsulares. They're from the Iberian Peninsula. They're from Spain itself. They hold the power. Their offspring, especially if they're with another Spaniard, then also hold power. Those are Creoles, people born in the New World, right? But then below them, you have other various mixtures of races, because a lot of these Europeans who come over, they also procreate with natives or with the slaves that they bring over from Africa and so on, right? So we get this interesting mixture of races, especially as race becomes this concept as we move into the 1600s. So basically in the Spanish Empire, we start to see the color of one's skin and the ethnic background begin to determine how much political sway and social sway you're going to have, and thus that's going to equal how much economic sway you are going to have. And this gives you an idea of the racial groups. It's ridiculous. There's so many. It's just bizarre how the Spanish ran this empire. But nonetheless, there you go. And like I said, the big competition, religiously speaking, amongst the Europeans is especially going to come with the Protestant Reformation in 1517, all thanks to this guy, Martin Luther. And basically we start to see Protestant countries and Catholic countries. Catholic Spain, Catholic France, Catholic Portugal, Anglican, but for the most part Protestant England, Protestant Dutch Netherlands, right? So Protestantism versus Catholicism on a global scale after 1517. So in conclusion here, basically, just to finish up, the Atlantic becomes this major nexus of world trade. It replaces the Silk Road, even the Indian Ocean, altering the balance of world trade and commerce. By the 1600s, we're going to have the Dutch, the French, the English establishing colonies in the Americas. English colonists, and we haven't even started talking about the English yet, but English colonists are going to want more land. They're going to enter into more conflicts with natives than even the other European countries or European peoples. The Dutch, who prided themselves on their devotion to liberty, and French settlements, on the other hand, were more economic and market adventure-oriented rather than settlements. So we see this, we're going to see this different mindset regarding colonization between the English as opposed to the Dutch or especially the French. And the French are going to make some pretty enduring alliances. They're going to trade with the natives. And the natives in these areas are going to have a little bit more freedom as trading partners with the French. Nonetheless, next time we'll delve into the English starting up their colonies in North America. Till then, signing out. Thanks for tuning in.